the focus, the psychology behind false confessions and eyewitness identification, I think that has really been exponentially developed within the last 10 years. I think, and you were talking about, you learned about it in law school. I mean, we kind of vaguely talked about it and kind of did some examples in law school, and the professor would have somebody come in, scream at him, throw a book, and, then run out of the room, and he'd ask, okay, I want you to describe the person that just did that, and everybody got it wrong, kind of thing. But we never got into the psychology behind that. Right. And so I'm wondering, you had mentioned it, I'm curious as to what they're teaching in law school these days about the psychology behind it.
So my experience from it came from a lot of different classes, actually. Criminal law, where you'd expect trial advocacy, again, where you'd expect constitutional law, where oftentimes conversation would run abreast of really interesting issues percolating up, but especially in the rules of evidence. And I think the reason why is the underpinning of so much of that logic, like you said, behind the law of evidence is trustworthiness. Is
reliability.
Is this reliable? Eyewitness identification, we are seeing it's becoming increasingly unreliable. And it's for anecdotes like you just mentioned. It's oftentimes not anyone doing it intentionally or on a conscious level. But I think that as it's becoming a bigger issue that science is becoming aware of, it can't help but trickle over into the law as well. And we've seen, there's been a huge death penalty abolitionist push that kind of tracks the development of the understanding that eyewitness identification is not the golden standard that it was once thought to be. I mean, Harris County is certainly topping the charts at actual innocence exonerations from death row. How many of those have been predicated on eyewitness identification? And like Steve mentioned earlier, how many of the recipients of that unfortunate, inexact science were minorities?
What would you say are some factors that come into play for misidentification of witnesses? And additionally, what are some things or some factors that you would think that would come into play or that you'd attack as a lawyer for giving a false confession?
I want to talk about false confession.
Okay.
Because the entire time that it's been on the table, there's one of my favorite books, East of Eden, kind of contemplates this. There's a character in East of Eden who, her body goes missing, and her parents are found murdered in this tragic house fire, right? And her body goes missing in the whole town. It's a small town, and they're all worried. Well, at first it's, oh, could it be you? Could it be you? And when there's no motive uncovered there, then they start looking outside of smaller town circles. And at length, what's described as a bumbling halfwit is brought in for questioning. And this man, JV, you mentioned earlier, why would like a logical, like procedural mind, why would somebody give a false confession? Why would somebody confess to something that didn't happen? Sometimes you can be led into it. You can't always assume that somebody's mind is logical or that someone's mind is operating even at the same level.
Sure.
These police officers are not just taught, they're encouraged to lie and to coerce. And we are taught from a very young age, if you're a child, what happens if you're separated from your parents? Go find a police officer. Go trust the cops. If you're in trouble, tell the truth. The truth will set you free. In this story in East of Eden, this small chunk of the narrative, it goes on to say that this bumbling halfwit was then delighted when he was indicted by a stern and frightened grand jury. At last, he thought that he had done something with himself. And the passage goes on to elaborate that the judge who presided at the examination before the plea was a man who was so good and pure that he canceled out a lot of wickedness with his life. And the judge revealed that without the proper prompting that this so-called culprit was used to, he couldn't remember whom he had killed or why or how or any attendant detail. So the judge sighed and he looked at the constable and he said, you shouldn't have done a thing like that. The law was designed to save, not to destroy. And we're seeing that a lot with actual innocence exoneration. I think it speaks to false confessions, and I think it speaks to the danger of improper eyewitness identification, which, as Steve pointed out, is becoming kind of an aggressive issue in these sorts of cases.